So thank you. Welcome everyone to the Food History Seminar. Today's speaker is Lauren Samuelsson from University of
Wollongong.
Sorry, I'm not good at that. From Australia. So she's come all the way over to Australia, especially for us, more or less. So you're a PhD candidate in your third year, and this is really about a big part of that study, I think, isn't it?
Yes,
so
it'd
be really interesting to hear what you have to say on that. So I'll let you introduce anything else you'd like to say about yourself, but over to you.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming along this afternoon. So this presentation is based on my PhD project, which I'm undertaking at the University of Wollongong in Australia. And basically my project seeks to understand the way that Australia's premier women's magazine, the Australian Women's Weekly, influenced Australian food culture from the 1930s to the 1980s. So my presentation is going to include 3 case studies. So we're going to be looking at mop foods, Chinese cuisine and weight loss diets and the way that they were portrayed in the magazine. And these are drawn from my thesis and address the ways that gender, class and race played out on the pages of the weekly, and in turn how the magazine shaped Australia's eating habits. So this is an ongoing project and I welcome any comments and questions or any feedback that you might have. All right. On the 8th of June 1933, the first edition of the Australian Women's Weekly hit the newsstands. It was a revelation, breaking completely from the style of other women's magazines published in Australia or imported from overseas. According to Dennis O'Brien, who wrote a history of the magazine commissioned for its 50th anniversary in 1983, the magazine had an unswerving Australian outlook and a vigour and sense of urgency in its newspaper appearance, a comparative brashness, as if it were in a hurry to put women into a modern context. The first edition of the weekly, 44 pages of black and white newsprint, sold out almost immediately. The demand was so great in its first week that a rush order of newsprint had to be procured from Canada. 121,000 copies were sold. The weekly went from strength to strength. It's been Australia's most widely read women's magazine since that first edition, and at the zenith of its popularity during the 1950s and 60s, over 25% of the population read the weekly. It had the largest circulation per capita of any women's magazine in the world. Reflecting on the popularity of the magazine prior to his death in 1981, the magazine's founder and first editor, George Wernicke, said, "Pretty well every woman over 2 generations in Australia has been touched by the influence of the Australian Women's Weekly. It does what it does better than any other paper. I look at it today and marvel at what it has become and what other enterprises it has given birth to. It has become an archetype of the nation and society into which it was born." Tucked away on page 35 of the weekly's first edition, printed at the tail end of the Great Depression, was an unobtrusive column. It was titled "What to Eat in Winter," the byline attributed to Kathleen Rice. Ms. Rice offered the readers of the new magazine recipes for pea soup, fish souffle, sardine cigarettes and Welsh rabbit. Beside it was a call for women to submit their best recipes for a weekly recipe contest. The winning recipe would receive £5, which according to the magazine was an amount which is more than many a full-time job nowadays, they were right, and which would be a boon to housewives on the lookout to combine money-making with their natural love and knowledge of cooking. Thus, ever so simply, began the weekly's long association with food. In the 1980s, it was claimed that few families would not have sat down to a meal prepared from a Women's Weekly recipe. So popular were the recipes shared in the weekly that a separate range of Women's Weekly cookbooks began being published within the first decade of circulation. Some of these cookbooks have become staples for Australian home cooks, have been reprinted multiple times over the intervening decades, and have been distributed worldwide. So the iconic Children's Birthday Cake book, for example, up on the screen there, has been reprinted 15 times since its original publication in 1980, and in and of itself has made a really large imprint on Australian popular culture. Clearly, the weekly has enjoyed immense popularity in the Australian kitchen, but despite this, however, there have been few academic studies that consider the influence of the weekly on the development of Australian food culture throughout the 20th century. My thesis seeks to address this gap in scholarship by exploring how the weekly constructed shared understandings about what was good to eat, what was foreign, and what was Australian. Until recently, food has been missing in Australian academic history, Colin Bannerman, who has written on the impact of print media on Australian food culture, among other topics, claimed that histories of Australian colonisation and nationhood have been written without reference to how settlers and descendants fed themselves. They failed the F test, according to Bannerman, displaying index entries for football, but not for food. This is despite the fact that, as cultural historian Tanya Luckins points out, the study of food and drink can be used to generate fresh understandings of broader historical forces, the list of which you can see on the screen there, and which is many. But of course, food has not been entirely forgotten, and there has been a growing interdisciplinary interest in Australian food history, especially in the last 2 decades. Some scholars have searched the historical record for evidence of Australia's gastronomic identity, sort of drawing on a nationalist approach, while others have investigated the food history of various regions of Australia, such as the Barossa Valley, and still more have looked at the impact of migration, particularly post-Second World War, on Australia's evolving food culture, looking at transported foodways, as well as how migrants dealt with Australia's food landscape. Commodity histories of various foods and drinks have also been considered. Cosmopolitanism and the growth of the restaurant also get attention, and there's a much needed growing awareness and interest in the history of Australian Indigenous foodways. And yet, apart from a few histories on cookbooks, such as Sarah Black's work on community cookbooks, much of Australia's food history scholarship neglects the site where food is both created and consumed most often, the home. Domestic production and consumption of food was an everyday practice. It is where most people learn what is good to eat, and studying what is eaten domestically can tell us a great deal about the development of Australian society and the processes of cultural change. So I'm just going to go a little bit into my project now. So in order to investigate the ways that the weekly influenced everyday food practices in Australia, I'm undertaking a mixed methodological approach to my research. So the bulk of my research is underpinned by textual analysis of recipes, advertisements, and food editorials within the magazine and cookbooks across the defined period, which is 1933 to 1982. So in 1983, the magazine changed from a weekly format to a monthly format, though it kept the weekly in the title. So that seemed like a suitable place to finish my study, even though it's just shy of the 50 years, it would have really rounded it out nicely. But I've used a slice sampling approach to create a database of editorial recipes and also recipes submitted by readers from each issue of the weekly from March, June, September and December in 5-year increments. Of course, that final period will be 4 years, which was a total of 179 issues over the 49 years, and it's yielded just over 3,100 recipes for analysis, which is quite a lot. This slice sampling approach not only allows for an investigation of changes and continuities over time, but it also allows for me to examine cultural material as a signifier of changing ideas. I've used sort of a combination of qualitative and quantitative analysis of this data, and I've been able to sort of identify broad trends and patterns which I've then explored in depth. I've also analysed a sample of 27 women's weekly cookbooks that were published during the time period. They're all cookbooks that were published and available separately to the magazine, so they weren't included or a supplement to the magazine, making the purchase of these books and their popularity an indicator of their influence. But of course, there are limitations to that data. Magazines and cookbooks don't provide evidence of what people ate, but rather what was considered culturally acceptable to eat. So while inclusion of recipes submitted by readers of the magazine can offer some insight into what was being cooked in the home, I've aimed to augment this data with social research in the form of oral history interviews and a survey of the Australian public. So I've undertaken oral history interviews with past and current food editors from the Weekly, including with one Pamela Clark, who started working at the Weekly in 1968 until her retirement late last year. Food editors had a profound influence on the construction of food culture within the context of the magazine. As Australian historian Susan Sheridan, who wrote a history of the Weekly, pointed out, the cookery editor's role is to introduce new food ideas while at the same time keeping up the supplies of familiar or family food. The food editor was providing her readers with what Janice Winship calls survival skills and daydreams. The interviews were designed to try and understand the food editor's role and their ability to act as an instigator of change. And they've given me a depth of information about how the magazine actively constructed Australian food culture. And that sort of information can't be gleaned from the pages of the magazine. In addition, Australian Consolidated Press, which is the Packer family's media empire to which the weekly belonged, has not made its corporate archive or any manuscripts associated with the company available for research purposes. So oral history interviews are one way that I can gain some understanding of the practices of the publication. So I also did an online survey of readers of the weekly, and it was open for several months in 2018. And I had 161 respondents, which was really great. The answers to the surveys have shed light on the way that memories of cooking food from the weekly's magazines and cookbooks have helped to create a shared cultural experience in its readers. And the responses have been really valuable in considering what was important to the readers of the magazine, what they valued most highly. But in order to determine the degree to which distinctive Australian food cultures emerge, also the degree to which Australia held on to traditional eating practices transported from Britain, and the degree to which Australian eating practices are similar to other settler colonies. I'm also undertaking a transnational analysis of the way that food was represented in women's magazines in the UK, Canada and New Zealand. So I'm looking at Women's Weekly and Women's Own in the UK, Chatelaine in Canada, and the New Zealand Women's Weekly in New Zealand. So I'm convinced that including transnational analysis is vital not only for situating Australian food culture in a global context, but also in considering the development of Australian food culture, given the links between food, identity and place, as well as the consideration of food as a commodity. So this is how my research sort of stands right now, and I'm interested in any feedback or suggestions you might have on my methodology and the research that I've done thus far. All right, so let's dive into these case studies. So for the rest of today's presentation, I'm going to explore these three case studies in sort of vaguely chronological order, and each of them interrogates a different and distinct element of Australian food history. So each case study will also contain a brief transnational analysis, just seeing how Australia differs from the UK, Canada and New Zealand respectively, given their shared culinary past. So first, I will consider the prevalence of mock foods in the magazine, examining how their appearance not only complicates the oft-repeated notion that middle-class Australian women were incompetent cooks, but shines a light on the complex cultural relationship that Australians have with meat eating. The second case study will focus on the way that the weekly influenced the adoption of Chinese food into the Australian domestic kitchen. Not only did the weekly include Chinese recipes earlier than expected, given Australia's monoculture in the interwar years, but in an effort to encourage Australian women to be adventurous in the kitchen, they also published recipes from ethnically Chinese women as well as from restaurants. And so finally, I will explore the multitudes of crash diets presented to the readers of the weekly. Like other Western countries, increasing affluence post-Second World War led to increasing waistlines at the same time that thinness became a cultural ideal for the white middle-class female readers of the weekly. The results of these conflicting realities was the publication of multiple diet plans in the weekly, and multiple diet plans, the popularity of which was astonishing. All right. So while undertaking my primary research and data collection, one of the first things that struck me was the presence of mock foods in the weekly. And I've recently written a journal article on this subject for Australian Historical Studies, and it's published online, so if you want to read more about that, because this is only touching briefly on it, if you let me know, I can help you out with that. So this article, for example, was published on the 1st of January 1944, just before the introduction of meat rationing, and it presented 6 recipes submitted by readers, 4 of which were for mock foods, approximation and substitutions for the real thing. The recipe that won first prize, mock pineapple, by Mrs. A.T. Robson, substituted fresh pineapple with vegetable marrow stewed with sugar and lemon to be served with custard. This recipe was joined by others for mock apples, Christmas mock ham and meatless sausage. Now, these were not the only mock recipes that I discovered in my analysis of the weekly. Further exploration uncovered a wide variety of mock foods, from basic forms like mock fish and mock raspberry jam, or mock quail in this case, to more extravagant examples like mock pâté de foie gras and mock champagne. Unsurprisingly, my research revealed that the majority of mock foods were published during the years of austerity generated by the Great Depression and the Second World War. By the 1970s, mock food had all but disappeared from the Australian table and the pages of the magazine, with the exception of mock cream for baking and vegetarian and vegan substitutes for meat, which we obviously still see a lot of today. And I thought that this warranted further investigation. And the prevalence of these recipes suggested to me that they were an important part of Australian food culture, because they could tell me what foods were really important to Australians and what foods had a lower status and were considered not good to eat. They also showed me that Australian women were far more experimental in the kitchen than they had been given credit for by many, who they're blamed often for Australia's boring and bland food culture in the early 20th century. But I think that mock foods illustrate that rather than being plain cooks held ransom to the winds of industrialisation, Australian women were inventive, responding to restrictions in the availability of culturally significant foods with ingenuity and oftentimes good humour. If modern Australian food culture can be defined, as food historian Barbara Santich claims, by our enthusiasm for new foods, our readiness to bend rules, our willingness to adopt, improvise and reinvent, then I believe that mock foods are really integral to Australia's culinary history. All right, let's get some numbers. Analysis of mock recipes in the magazine demonstrates their popularity during hard times. So I did keyword searches of the weekly, looking for terms such as mock, sham, imitation, those sorts of words, and it led to the identification of 331 recipes between 1933 and 1982. Of these recipes, 211 were published during the 1930s and 40s, so about 64% of them were published during the 1930s and 40s, and then of those, about 50% were published during the war years. So the majority of recipes in the 30s and 40s were submitted by readers to the weekly recipe competition rather than by food editors. And recipes contributed by readers could be considered more indicative of actual consumption than editorial recipes, so this suggests that the recipes could have been cooked on a fairly regular basis. So in the 30s and 40s, the reader recipes were about 65% of those. So apart from a small spike in the 1960s, which you can see here, which can be attributed to multiple recipes for mock cream during Australia's baking boom, the publication of mock recipes declined significantly after the 1940s. By the 1970s, the number of the recipes had dwindled, with only 10 recipes being published during that decade, and I think there was one in the 1980s. But of course, mock foods are not particular to Australia. They were transported with British colonists. As many of you in this room would be aware, the British culinary tradition is no stranger to mock foods, perhaps most famously mock turtle soup, which was wildly popular during the mid-19th century. Here's an Australian version from 1882. However, the Australian context, conditions and resources were notably different to those of Britain, and this led to the popularity of different mock foods calling for different ingredients, and even mock foods designed to imitate those foods available at home, but not in the Antipodes, such as colonial goose, which was made from mutton, a plentiful protein in Australia. So the Australian tradition of mock foods was well established by the time the weekly was first published in June 1933. At that time, in the context of the Great Depression, when families were grappling with unemployment and poverty, mock foods flourished. However, at a cost of 2p, the same price as a pound of cheap sausage meat, the first editions of the weekly were probably not purchased by those hardest hit by the Depression, like this guy. This was a middle-class publication. Nonetheless, very few Australian families escaped the Depression without some change to their dietary habits, but these changes mostly involved buying cheaper ingredients, so for example, substituting the cheaper mutton for beef. Families also grew produce at home and collected food items by foraging, fishing and hunting. The reliance on cheap and available ingredients led to monotony, a diet of stew, bread and dripping. So understandably, housewives tried to make food, as the weekly's editors put it, more novel, and mock foods were one way that they did this. Australian households had barely recovered from the Depression when World War II enforced more austerity. So Australia was spared the intense rationing experienced in Britain, where, as you would know, access to dietary staples such as meat, dairy, tea and sugar was restricted well into the post-war years. Nonetheless, Australia's role as the food arsenal for the Allied world did result in local shortages, and rationing commenced with the regulation of tea in July 1942, sugar in August 1942, butter in June 1943, and meat in January 1944. And potatoes, eggs, bacon, tinned goods, and fresh milk were also intermittently in short supply. In response to these shortages, Australian women shared and requested recipes in the weekly to imitate foods they could not or would not do without. Some of the mock recipes that made multiple and regular appearances, by virtue of which they could be considered popular, included mock cream, mock oysters, mock marzipan, mock ham, and mock champagne. Contributors to the magazine weren't hiding the fact that these recipes were an antidote for scarcity. The recipe for whipped austerity cream or poor man's pâté de foie gras leave little doubt that these were cheaper alternatives to the real thing. So now I'm going to turn analysis to one of the most popular mock foods, mock chicken. Today, Australians are among the highest consumers of chicken meat in the world, far outpacing consumption in the UK. So Australia's there in the red, UK in the purple there. However, before the implementation of modern chicken farming practices in the mid-20th century, poultry, and particularly chicken, was a novelty, a dish served on celebratory occasions. Prior to the pre-packaged frozen supermarket product of the 1970s, roasting a chicken was, as food scholar Jane Dixon puts it, an act of love, a symbol of a special occasion, a rare treat signalling a religious holiday. Unsurprisingly, recipes for mock chickens proliferated during the 1930s and 40s when chicken was prohibitively costly. Mock poultry, including chicken, quail, goose and duck, made up around 20% of all mock food recipes, but of these, just over half were for mock chicken, most published during the 1930s and 40s. From the 1970s, the weekly published no recipes for mock chicken at all. Thus, the weekly clearly illustrates the changing place of chicken in Australian food culture, from a time when home cooks needed to create alternatives to a more modern chicken consumption, where chicken is a really affordable everyday protein. So, enterprising cooks created numerous dishes that fell into the category of mock chicken croquettes, for example, as well as mock chicken mould, mock chicken cutlets, which you can see in the picture here. They've got little fake fringed bones on the end, which I think is really lovely. Mock chicken loaf, and the popular mock chicken pie. Rabbit was by far the most common protein substituted for chicken in these recipes, and 2/3 of mock chicken recipes use rabbit as an alternative. The use of rabbit as a substitute for chicken demonstrates the influence of austerity on the Australian diet and reveals the way that various foodstuffs hold different cultural capital in distinctive national contexts. So by the 20th century, rabbit was a pest in Australia. Having multiplied quickly after the introduction of just 5 rabbits in 1788, 100 years later, rabbits were found in plague proportions in many parts of the country. Clearly they were plentiful, and they were cheap and maybe free if you were good at hunting. They were an alternative for other higher status meat. It was a meat of necessity, it was seen as a meat of poverty, and it was reflected in euphemistic names like underground mutton or poor man's chicken. Australians' memories of food during the Great Depression are infused with rabbit. Reliance on rabbit for protein led to a monotonous diet consisting of stewed rabbit, baked rabbit, roast rabbit, fried rabbit, and fricasseed rabbit. According to oral histories, many children of the Depression vowed never to eat another rabbit as long as they lived. But despite these declarations, rabbit consumption spiked again during World War II, with Australians consuming around 27 million rabbits a year during the 1940s. And of course, that's just official data. We don't know how many rabbits were hunted. As an unrationed protein, rabbits, like offal and sausage, became a food of necessity once meat rationing was introduced. By late in the war, Australians were weary of rabbit again. In 1944, Olwen Francis, who was the weekly's food editor at the time, addressed the tedium of consuming rabbit in a feature titled "Any Way You Like 'Em, Rabbit Dishes." She did great titles. Francis claimed that, with some of us, our very familiarity with the rabbit leads to culinary contempt, but epicures find it as delicate to the palate as a tender bird. It is worthy of a place on the weekly menu. After prompting housewives to remember the gustatory virtues of rabbit, tellingly describing it as bird-like, Francis offered recipes for rabbit prepared in a multitude of ways, although the recipes for baked rabbit, rabbit casserole, and rabbit pie hardly pushed the boundaries of inventive rabbit preparation. One way of addressing the boredom of a rabbit-centric diet was to prepare it in the form of mock food, transforming the unexciting, mundane protein into something special, appropriating the cultural capital of chicken. Frances's recipe for mock chicken chow mein would have been an intriguing recipe for the wartime housewife to emulate. It was the first mention of chow mein in the weekly, and it used rabbit as a substitute for chicken. The recipe shows a great deal of innovation and creativity, though its authenticity is dubious at best. Whether or not the weekly's readers cooked the adventurous mock chicken chow mein, Frances raised the possibility that rabbit could be less monotonous and could be pleasing for the family. As she put it, mock chicken chow mein was penny-conscious, interesting to prepare and to eat. But why is the transformation of rabbit into chicken important? Well, it sheds light on the cultural importance and class connotations of meat consumption in Australia. Australians have a complicated relationship with meat consumption, historically celebrating the ability of all social classes to eat high-quality meat. Writing in the late 19th century, Englishman Richard Twopenny claimed, "Meat is the staple of Australian life. A working man whose whole family did not eat meat 3 times a day would indeed be a phenomenon. High and low, rich and poor, all eat meat to an incredible extent, even in the hottest weather." Meat eating meant that the Australian worker was better than the worker left behind in England, and meat eating became a part of Australia's identity. The importance of meat and its links with higher class continued into the 20th century. Demonstrating these links, a mid-1930s report from the Commonwealth Advisory Council on Nutrition, which was conducting a study of the nation's diet, claimed that class consciousness led the Australian on low income to demand only those cuts of meat which are popularly regarded as superior: steak, choice chops, and sirloins. So culturally superior meat consumption reflected status, and the primarily middle-class readers of the weekly clung to superior meat eating as best they could, by pretending. Now, the British were also encouraged to eat rabbit during wartime. However, they don't seem to have turned it into mock anything that I can find, just into pies, curries and stews, as this 1941 poster from the Ministry of Food illustrates. I've had a look at women's magazines, Woman's Own and Woman's Weekly, and they show why wartime recipes in Britain were far more austere than those in Australia, and did use a lot of substitutes. The use of the word mock or its alternatives really appeared infrequently, and I have a suspicion that this is something to do with keeping up morale, but it's just something that I've started looking at, so I'll know a bit more about that in the future. So the Australian context, with its celebration of superior meat eating and distaste for proteins of poverty such as rabbit, led to the reimagining of it as various other foodstuffs in a way that wasn't done in Britain, often into mock chicken, which had grander cultural connotations. The post-war disappearance of mock chicken made with rabbit or tripe or other substitutions confirms that these foods were a product of scarcity. So by the 1960s, as demonstrated by this editorial from 1961, chicken was considered economical enough for a reasonable family meal. The reign of mock chicken had ended. All right, let's move on to Chinese food. So I'm going to analyse the representation of Chinese cuisine in the weekly and the tactics used by the magazine to encourage Australians to cook Chinese food in the home. From the late 1930s, the weekly positioned domestic Chinese cookery as practical, quick and cheap and healthy, as well as a site of exotic fantasy and class distinction. So the Chinese food that was highlighted in the weekly was the sort of Chinese food that you could find on the menu of many a Chinese restaurant. So honey prawns, Mongolian beef, lemon chicken, sweet and sour pork. And it was this hybrid Chinese-Australian cuisine that home cooks embraced throughout the late 20th century. While historians and sociologists have considered both the proliferation and role of the Chinese restaurant in Australia and other Western countries, very few have considered the role that magazines played in the adoption of Chinese food in the domestic sphere. So here I'll consider how the weekly encouraged Australian housewives to cook Chinese food for themselves. So Chinese restaurants have enjoyed a long history in Australia, and they're a mainstay in both urban centres and country towns, and often in the latter they may be the only restaurant in town. The first Chinese restaurant in Australia was opened by Chinese butcher John R. Lu on the Ballarat goldfields in 1853. So this is a lithograph of his first restaurant, which was actually on Main Road in Ballarat. And it was identified as John R. Lu's Chinese restaurant, Soup's Always Ready, and you can see that up the top there. There's some debate as to whether Alu sold both Australian and Chinese meals, or Australian meals only, with some maintaining that Chinese food was the only thing not sold there. By the late 1800s, many hotels were employing Chinese cooks, and Chinese restaurants had sprung up in Chinatowns across Australia. Chinese men, who were considered to be excellent cooks, were also employed as domestic staff from the 1870s onwards. However, it's very unlikely that they were cooking Chinese food for their white employers. By the early 20th century, Chinese restaurants were concentrated in the Chinatown areas of large cities such as Sydney and Melbourne, and they were usually run by ethnically Chinese proprietors. The location of the restaurants close to theatre districts and other nighttime entertainments made Chinese restaurants a magnet for the cosmopolitan crowd, as the Chinese proprietors aimed to gain non-Chinese patrons. However, this patronage was limited to those who could access these areas and who had the appropriate cultural capital to sort of enjoy Chinese food. According to food historian Andrew Juna, during the interwar period, genuine ethnic food, including Chinese, was localised within pockets of cosmopolitan inner suburbs, known only to a lucky few gourmands and migrants. And post-war musings on Chinese food sort of support this theory. In a 1949 feature on Chinese restaurants and Chinese cooking, Pix magazine claimed that 10 years ago, Chinese food was something eaten mainly by self-professed gourmets, an affectation looked upon with suspicion by everyday steak-eating Australians. It wasn't until the Second World War that everyday steak-eating Australians really became familiar with Chinese food, but once they did, it really spread quickly. While Chinese restaurants were mainly an urban phenomenon throughout the war, by the 1950s they were spreading to suburbia. By 1960, over 40% of Sydney's Chinese restaurants could be found in the suburbs, and more Chinese restaurants were being established in the main streets of small towns across the country. And often you will find them looking like this. This one is from Newcastle, a picture taken in 1986. So the combination of increased affluence, leisure time, and a celebration of consumerism meant that the average Australian was frequenting restaurants and eating out more than they had before. So Australian food historian Cecilia Leong-Salabier describes how people brought their saucepans to these modest Chinese restaurants to buy takeaway meals of chow mein or sweet and sour pork. And I think that that's a bit more environmentally friendly than our plastic containers now. These foreign ingredients, so far removed from meat and 3 veg, as well as like strange rituals with chopsticks and new flavours, really enticed Australians who were keen on novelty. By the 1950s, wide swathes of the population were familiar with Chinese food, even if it had been modified for the Australian market. And it was this familiarity that the Weekly played upon when providing its readers with recipes for Chinese food to cook in the home. So from the very start, there were tangible links between Chinese restaurant food and the Chinese food that Australians were able to cook in their kitchen. J.A.G. Roberts, who investigated the way that Chinese food spread throughout the Western world, concluded that attempts by Westerners to cook Chinese food for themselves were an integral part of the proliferation of Chinese food worldwide. Roberts claims that the attempts of Westerners to cook Chinese food for themselves were facilitated by the publication of recipe books and by the greater availability of Chinese foodstuffs in various forms in shops and supermarkets. And in the American context, Harvey Levenstein claimed that the increasing popularity of Chinese food during the 1960s there was due to women's magazines, including ladies' home journals, intrepid restaurant critics, and the marketing of canned products such as Heinz soup. Levenstein was quick to point out that the chop suey and chow mein that took over Middle America in what he calls a steady march was egregiously inauthentic. However, notes that the eating and liking of homemade chow mein still represented a distinct step towards Americans breaking out of their culinary straitjacket. So while many Australians were not familiar with Chinese cuisine until the 1950s, the Weekly offered some very early recipes for Chinese-style foods. The first explicitly Chinese recipe in the Weekly was a recipe for Chinese chop suey, published in July 1934, and it's up there. It's actually pork chops. I don't know if that's why they think it's chop suey. I don't know if it's a play on words. But it was in an editorial feature that provided unusual savoury dishes to be served at dinner, luncheon, or an informal tea. And this recipe is indicative of the types of Chinese recipes shared in the Weekly prior to the Second World War, in that it was decidedly inauthentic. While this recipe suggested using soy sauce with Worcester sauce as an alternative, most recipes forewent the use of soy sauce or any other Chinese flavours completely. One example of this is a reader-submitted recipe shared in 1937. The recipe for Mildura chop suey, which you can see there on the slide, was a sort of strange conglomeration of beef, pasta, potato, and dried fruit flavoured with curry powder. Mildura is a small regional city in northern Victoria, and it's known for its fruit production, particularly grapes, which perhaps accounts for the dried fruit. But Mildura chop suey offers evidence that the concept of Chinese food had captured the imagination of the interwar Australian housewife, even if she didn't quite grasp the essence of the cuisine. And yet, authentic Chinese food was being presented by the weekly's food editors by the late 1930s, which is quite early. In 1939, Mary Forbes, who was the food editor, provided readers with some unusual savoury dishes from China that you'll find not only lots of fun to cook, but delicious to eat. Her article, which she claimed consisted of recipes given to her by a friend from out east, clearly aimed to introduce Australian women to Chinese food beyond chop suey. Forbes claimed that when her friend wanted to introduce me to some real Eastern cooking, that she accepted with some misgivings. I had visions of being expected to eat such extraordinary mysteries as seaweed soup or bird's nest stew. Instead, Forbes claimed, I had a most interesting and delicious meal. While the recipes that Forbes provided were intended to replicate Eastern cooking and had Chinese names such as Chou Lao Yu and Bu Lu Gai, she presented them in a non-threatening way. She positioned herself with the readers, embarking on a culinary adventure that didn't include bird's nest stew. In addition, Forbes's recipes did not prescribe the use of ingredients, methods or utensils that would have been unfamiliar to the Australian housewife. There is nary a wok in sight. These were recipes that the average cook would have been comfortable with. And while there was mention of root ginger and soybean sauce in some of the recipes, the recipe for tin swin pai kueh, pork with sweet and sour sauce, instructed the reader to use vinegar, sugar, mustard pickles and Worcester sauce to make the sweet and sour sauce for their fried pork. American food scholar Sherry Innes has claimed that in the 1950s America, the publication of Chinese cooking literature written by Chinese women served as a bridge between cultures, in a time when cooking literature rarely depicted non-white faces. And in Australia, which was similar, the weekly served this role, featuring food editorials with recipes contributed by ethnically Chinese women from the late 1930s. In doing this, they not only familiarised Australians with Chinese food, but also Chinese culture and history. So the earliest of these appeared in 1938 in a feature entitled Eating in Chinese Style. According to the weekly, the recipes were given at a demonstration of Chinese cookery by Mrs. Elsie Lee Sung, who is pictured here in her Chinese dress, and Mrs. Fabian Chow, who have been visiting Australia to raise funds for Chinese civilian relief. So they were genuine Chinese women. They assured readers that the ingredients are all available here. Yet there was no doubt that these recipes and the method of cooking them was foreign. The weekly claimed that to beat eggs for an omelette, Mrs. Lee Sung flourished 4 chopsticks held deftly in her right hand. And that to chop both meat and vegetables, she used a murderous-looking deep-bladed chopper. This was a spectacle, and for the housewife, this type of cookery was sure to impress. Why not stagger your friends with an entire menu of Chinese dishes, served at a table set with Chinese china and chopsticks, the article suggested. So, some of the Chinese women featured in the magazine were socially important, lending Chinese food an air of sophistication. So, for example, Mrs. L.M. or Phyllis Wang contributed recipes to a feature entitled Chinese Style in May 1953. The recipes included fried rice, mushrooms and prawns, duck and pineapple canton, and also beef chop suey, which the weekly claimed Mrs. Wang invented after her son developed a taste for roast beef and sausages at boarding school. Mrs. Wang was the wife of the Consul General for the Republic of China and had arrived in Australia in the late 1930s. Here's a picture of her from 1945. And she and her husband became naturalised Australian citizens in 1956, some of the first Chinese Australians to do so. Mrs. Wang was a well-known figure in Sydney's Chinese community in particular, and was identifiable to Anglo-Australians due to her wearing traditional Chinese dress through the streets of the city. By drawing on the cultural knowledge of well-known Chinese figures when sharing Chinese recipes, the weekly was lending an air of authenticity to its publication and differentiating itself from other publications which didn't include these sorts of features. The weekly also spent time introducing Australian women to this foreign foodway, not only providing recipes, but also instructions on the differing meal structure and how to correctly use chopsticks, for example. So this is from a 1964 editorial called Chinese Party Food, and it instructs readers on how to manage chopsticks. It's a 3-step process illustrated with pictures and had hints and tips on how to best use the unfamiliar implements. But even with this pictographic instruction, LMA Wong, who wrote the feature, warned readers, don't expect to be able to pick up individual grains of rice immediately. That comes with long experience. It's interesting that very few of these early Chinese features, like up until the late 1970s, were written by or attributed to the primarily white food editors of the magazine. They were guest contributors. Now we're going to have a look at the similarities and parallels between Australian and Canadian Chinese experience. And so there are similarities between Australia and Canadian Chinese experience, which are include but aren't limited to the provenance of Chinese migrants to both of the countries. So both of them had migrants primarily from Guangdong or Canton province, and both countries had exclusionary migration policies. And yet, despite these parallels, there's differences in the way that Chinese food was adopted domestically, and which can be seen in the pages of the weekly and the Canada's women's magazine, Chatelaine. So evidence from Chatelaine shows similar preoccupation with Chinese food by the mid-1960s. According to its editors, by 1965, the most popular foreign dish was Chinese, followed by Italian. However, unlike in the weekly, analysis of the magazine prior to the 1960s shows a distinct lack of recipes for Chinese food to be cooked in the home. So of the recipes that I sampled for Chatelaine, and I'm doing a similar slice sampling approach for these magazines, the earliest Chinese recipe that I found was from December 1948. It's called Holiday Chop Suey. Now, Chatelaine Institute director Murray Holmes declared that the ingredients, which included tomato soup for the holiday touch, needed to be cooked together just enough to be tender and develop the flavours. According to her, this was the secret for successful chop suey. While chop suey has dubious and contested origins and even more contested ingredients, the recipe presented in Chatelaine was far from Chinese cuisine. The only notably Chinese ingredient was soy sauce. But by the mid-1960s, chop suey was joined by sweet and sour pork, chow mein noodles, sweet and sour short ribs, as Chinese food began to appear more often in Chatelaine's monthly menus feature. The recipes for Chinese food that were shared in Chatelaine were primarily Americanized recipes like chop suey, and this was not the same as in Australia, where recipes for chop suey and chow mein were actually in the minority. So I think that this phenomenon can potentially be traced to a number of factors. Firstly, Canadians had been exposed to years of Americanized Chinese food, making them familiar with this type of cookery. It wasn't threatening, whereas Australians really only were exposed to that type of Chinese food during the war when we had American servicemen stationed in Australia. Secondly, Australia's climate was more conducive to the availability of fresh produce year-round, making it easier to cook Chinese food that required fresh vegetables rather than relying on tinned vegetables and soups and things like that that were integral to dishes like chop suey. And finally, the differences in the restaurant industry in Australia and Canada led to differences in the home. Julie Stacker, who undertook a comparison of Chinese restaurants in Sydney and Toronto up until the 1950s, showed various differences between the restaurants in these cities. Firstly, Chinese restaurants in Toronto were styled as Canadian restaurants and served Canadian home cooking alongside a few Chinese dishes, while restaurants in Sydney and Melbourne offered elaborate Chinese menu. And to some extent, the differing Chineseness of the experience in these restaurants was a result of government policy. In Australia, Chinese restaurants had to be seen as non-competitive with Australian businesses, so that's why their menus centred around Chinese cuisine. The fact that Australian Chinese restaurants were more likely to provide Chinese food to their patrons potentially made Australians more open to trying to make exotic Chinese food when it was presented to them in the weekly. The impact of Chinese restaurants can clearly be seen in the magazine, and the Chinese cooking class cookbook, published in the late 1970s, was also heavily influenced by by Chinese restaurant cookery. They had a whole section of the cookbook dedicated to restaurant specials, where the weekly's food editor asked some of our favourite restaurants to part with a favourite recipe. The cookbook was very influential in encouraging Australians to cook Chinese at home. One respondent to my survey recalled the Chinese cooking class cookbook vividly, sharing, "The very first cookbook that I bought was the Chinese, and a friend and I were just amazed by it and drooled over every photo while having coffee one day. I still remember this way back in 1980. We were so taken with those photos that we decided to have a dinner party where we shared the cooking. One of the best evenings ever, and my deep fried ice cream balls were the best. I haven't tasted better since at any of the Chinese restaurants that I've visited." So, through its focus on including Chinese women and Chinese restaurant food in its food features, the weekly encouraged the adoption of Chinese food in the Australian domestic kitchen, where it's still a weeknight staple in many Australian homes. They diminished scary and foreign elements of Chinese cookery for their readers and made Chinese food accessible, highlighting not only its novelty, but also how it was quick to make and healthy, and how it was the perfect family meal. All right, now we come to the third case study, and this is one that I've really only just started looking at. So the analysis needs a bit more work, but I thought I would just talk through some of my findings and some preliminary ideas about what those findings might mean. So, one of the things that I noticed when I was looking at the weekly was that from the 1950s onwards, the number of weight loss diets in the magazine really exploded. In our oral history interview, I asked Pamela Clark, who had been working in the weekly's test kitchen since 1968, about the number of diets in the magazine. She confirmed that the weekly was famous for its fad diets, many of which she had written. They caused all sorts of riots, really, she said. I mean, it was fascinating. If the weekly did any kind of diet, didn't matter whether it was ours or one bought from overseas, the weekly would sell out. It was amazing. She suggested to me that maybe it could be part of the thesis, and I agreed. So I set about looking into the appearance of the diets for weight loss, and there's a decided pattern that can be seen in their publication. In the sample magazines from the 1930s and 40s, dietary advice in the weekly was very scientific and was very focused in advising the reader how to get enough nutrition. So food editorials like this 1936 feature about cooking with tomatoes was also preoccupied with vitamins and the nutrient value of food. And this mirrors the concern about nutrition that the Australian government had during the 1930s as a result of nationwide concern about the nutrition of the lower classes. The government set up an advisory council on nutrition, which I spoke about briefly in the Mock Foods case study. They undertook a nationwide survey about the types and amounts of foods that Australians were eating, and they then reported on those findings over a series of years. So it was very much in the national consciousness that people weren't getting enough nutrition and that lots of Australians were undernourished. We can see this sort of preoccupation in the very first issue of the weekly, in that first food column, where Kathleen Rice admonishes those mothers who feed their family well but satisfies herself with a cup of tea and bread and butter. "Change your ways," she says, "before serious illness overtakes you." The cause of the mother satisfying herself with tea and bread and butter is attributed to curtailed incomes, which lead people to think about economising in the kitchen. According to Rice, this is unadulterated folly. There are obvious links here with scarcity of income and scarcity of food leading to poor nutrition. We see this sort of advice through the 1940s and particularly during the war. Articles like this one by Olwen Francis, who was actually trained in nutrition at King's College in London, show the same concerns about health and strength being reliant on getting enough food. In this article entitled "Of Course You Can Plan Inspirational Meals," Francis claims that Australian women are fast becoming nutrition conscious. They have learned to memorise vitamins, count up calories, and follow faithfully the daily food pattern. Yet a meal which may be nutritionally adequate can fall short of dietetic standards if it is lacking in appetite appeal. So really little has changed. Women then were still responsible for the nutritional health of their families, as well as keeping them satisfied taste-wise. In the food pages, there was no talk of losing weight during these straitened times. When weight loss was mentioned, it was positioned more as entertainment than nutritional advice. This article appeared on the front page of the second issue of the weekly in 1933, titled The Very Latest Slimming Ideas. It contained cunning and pleasant menus that really reduce you. It was written by Nell Murray, the weekly's representative in Europe, and the article presented Australian women with the very latest ideas on slimming, which is so very important to women. However, the article is more voyeuristic than prescriptive. There's no recipe ideas, and the subject of the article is less the diet and more this London society woman who is noted for her trim figure and who has figured out a way to keep herself slim without inconveniencing her friends. These were stories about the rich and powerful. They were daydreams, not survival skills. But all of this changed in the 1950s. From this point in time, we see articles like 1958's Be Fit, Not Fat, which advise calorie restriction in order to lose extra pounds. In 1963, for example, the weekly published 7 diets, including the black and red diet pictured here. So, published in November 1963, this is a complex plan which sees people eating a combination of foods labelled either red, which are protein and fat containing, or black, which are carbohydrate containing, and it's very complicated and hard to follow. But all of the diet issues sold very well indeed. The weekly's editor at the time, Esme Fenston, noticed the possibility that they were on to too much of a good thing. In a memo to Frank Packer, who owned the magazine, she claimed that 7 dieting features in 1 year was probably too many for our own good. Some of the features from the sampled issues include the Low Calorie Cookbook from 1968, Get Slim, Stay Slim Cookbook from 1973, as well as like 1-page or 2-page features like slimming meals the whole family will enjoy. And then from the late 1970s, the diets get outrageous. 1978 saw the publication of The Spaghetti Diet, where readers were assured that they could lose 2.5 kilograms or 5 pounds a month if they followed the nutrition plan given, which basically suggests having fruit and coffee for breakfast, soup and fruit for lunch, and a pasta dish with salad and more fruit for dessert. There's a lot to unpack in 1982's 10-day Chinese Yum Yum Diet for 2, where readers are assured that they will shed up to 4 kilograms while eating a diet that doesn't taste like a diet, 10 days of delicious Chinese food. But what's interesting about the weekly's diets is that they seem to veer away from the increasingly popular weight loss programs like Weight Watchers, which crossed the Pacific from the US to Australia in 1969. And they focused instead on diets presumably created by the staff in the test kitchen or diet books published by various nutritionists or gurus or celebrities. So this is an early article about Weight Watchers coming to Australia in 1969, and I just love the title. It's ridiculous. So this is very different to New Zealand, where the New Zealand Woman's Weekly, while not as preoccupied with weight loss as its Australian counterpart, had an emphasis on weight loss programs such as Weight Watchers. And what I really enjoy in a group called the Auckland Chub Club, which is really great. But from the late 1970s, the New Zealand Woman's Weekly published some recipe features from Weight Watchers, but it didn't publish dieting features of its own in the issues of the magazine that I have sampled, at least. Once again, I'm sort of only in the early stages of investigating this issue, but it makes me wonder if the test kitchen staff at the weekly were just more preoccupied with weight loss than Tui Flower, who was the head of the New Zealand Women's Weekly test kitchen at the time. Certainly, Pamela Clark, who I interviewed, was a fan of the fad diet when she was working at the Weekly. In 2004, she published a cookbook called The Magazine Editor's Diet, in which she claimed, "I really do know how it feels to be overweight. I'm on your side, and from sharing just about everything I know about fat and dieting, I hope my story can help you achieve a slimmer, healthier, more positive you." All right, well, thank you for staying with me thus far. So just to recap, the overarching aim for my research project is to discover how the Weekly, which is the bastion of Australian culture, constructed shared understandings about what was good to eat, what was considered foreign, and what was Australian. And I think that these 3 case studies are sort of exemplars of how the Weekly was able not only to reflect wider cultural changes in 20th century Australia, but also how the Weekly was able to affect changes in the kitchen. Mock Foods tell us not only how Australian women responded to scarcity in the kitchen, but also about the cultural value of certain foodstuffs. They were so important that they mimicked them. Looking at Chinese food in the magazine tells us that Australians were interested in Asian food earlier than expected, particularly in light of Australia's exclusionary migration policies, and shows how the weekly positioned it as being special through highlighting Chinese women and Chinese restaurant food. And finally, the way that weight loss is presented shows fluctuating associations between nutrition, food and weight, and is potentially a reflection of the preoccupations of the staff of the magazine. So once again, thank you for coming along this afternoon, and I welcome any questions and comments that you might have. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Can I open it up to the floor first of all?
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
When did woks come in? Because I remember probably about the early 80s here, and they were advertised in all the colour supplements.
Yeah.
They sort of shifted a bit to semi-authentic from previously been Vesta Chop Suey or something.
Yeah, they were definitely available in the 1970s. So in sort of department store features, they're advertising that you can buy woks. Woks there definitely by the early 1970s, but I'm not sure exactly when. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, it was very interesting. I think the 3 case studies work really well, and congratulations. Also, I enjoyed the aspect of the image research. So being Italian, I confirm that eating spaghetti every day doesn't make you slim. And secondly, that being Italian, I'm obsessed with food and also with oral history. So the question is about the methodology and about the oral history that you collected. So I was wondering how you publicized your project, so how you got the interviewees, and what kind of effort have you made to have representation of not just Australian, native Australian readers, but also of other communities, which might regard food as very important, such as the Greek and Italian community in Australia.
Yep. So the oral history section, I focused on the women who worked at the magazine, whereas the survey, I really focused on getting a wider cross-section of the Australian public. So I mostly did that by advertising online and through various groups. So I did target groups like the CWA, the Country Women's Association, but of course I was looking...
The Women's Institute.
Yeah, like the Women's Institute, yep. But of course that wasn't going to give me that wide cross-section. So I also went out to other groups and asked them to sort of send it around. And I did get quite a variety of respondents, including men, and people from a wide variety of backgrounds as well, which was really good. I did sort of want to get that cross-section. Yeah.
Thanks.
It was, yeah, an absolutely fascinating book, thank you. Got a query about, you were talking about meat and the sort of class hierarchy, and I was wondering if vegetables were viewed the same way, whether they were signifiers of class.
I don't think so. It's certainly not something that I came up against. And I mean, meat was the be-all and end-all of Australian cookery. And I mean, it still is. Our Prime Minister's waging war on vegans at the moment, so who knows? It's definitely very focused on meat. And I mean, vegetables were just sort of cooked to within an inch of their lives until the 1970s. So it was just stodge.
I noticed right back at the beginning, you featured mock apples, which seemed an extraordinary thing to need a mock version of in Australia.
It was chocos that they sort of made into mock apple. Yeah, it's very strange. I maybe am assuming it came from someone maybe in, say, northern Queensland or something like that, that didn't readily have apples available to them. Yeah.
And chocos do literally grow like weeds.
They do, yeah.
So it's more maybe a case of what you do with the chocos rather than trying to remove potato apples.
How do I make chocos more interesting? Yeah.
Okay, if I may, I have to say thank you very much, because you've just basically done a tour of my childhood, which was not quite in class positions. I grew up in a sort of more working class So this was too higher aspiration. Although my mother did have a Woman's Weekly cookbook, which she probably got given when she was married,
Yes.
which was in 1965.
Yeah.
And in which spaghetti bolognese and fried rice were in the exotic foreign dishes section. I suppose one of the things that you said at the start that I suppose I'd like to question or challenge from my own experience is you know, saying Australian cooks were inventive. I guess this does not reflect my experience of Australian cookery in the late 60s through the 1970s.
Yeah.
You know, my mother, God love her, hated cooking with a passion and was really, really bad at it, and her mother was terrible at it. But, you know, it's not true that every meal of my childhood consisted of cheap fried steak in an electric fry pan, no sauce. You didn't mention with mock meals, of course, we're getting into the industrialised mocked mashed potato out of a packet, and fried peas and corn. That was an entire meal of my childhood. So, you know, this is all aspiration. How much does this actually reflect what people were eating?
Yes, it's a really good question, and that's something that I struggle with. I think that what I can show is that people maybe wanted to be more creative and were coming up with the ideas, if not necessarily able to sort of follow it through to fruition, especially if you're sort of looking at sort of working class and lower middle class homes in particular, where your income couldn't stretch to being inventive because that was waste. If it didn't go right, that was, you know, it was waste. So it is certainly probably more towards the higher end, and it is very aspirational. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
When you said honey prawns, you took me back to somewhere, it would have been about 1973 to 1975. We got takeaway from the RSL club, which is the Return Services League club. And this was like a really special, exciting meal. And I can still remember the taste of those honey prawns, actually.
So thank you very much for the talk. I have a question or a couple of points about the survey respondents and how perhaps you may have thought about issues of food memory, and also connected to them, on the survey, did you ask them sort of what position they held? Were they did they consume the food, or did they cook the food, and sort of that in terms of family dynamic?
Yeah, absolutely. So I sort of I focused on two areas in the survey, which was your memories from childhood, and sort of what the family dynamics were in your home. So who did the majority of cooking when you were a child? Did they use the weekly? You know, was it your mother or your grandmother, or who sort of took charge of that? And then also as an adult, and were you sort of the major, you know, cook in the house, or was it your partner, or whatever? So I did try to address those different roles that people have and that people play. And I really wanted to, because of course I'm looking at a period from 1930 to 1980, so I tried to capture people that were towards the start of that time as well. So I did, you know, I did have some respondents that were born in like the early 1930s. So I sort of got a fair spread across the time, but of course most of it was sort of from the 60s through to the 80s, yeah. There were lots of memories about cake.
Just a follow-up question. You sort of mentioned it. Were these sources, the magazines, digitised?
Yes.
So that's how you could do keyword. Are they clean copies, so they're unannotated?
Yes.
Did you ever, or have you thought about following up with survey respondents as to whether they have kept the magazines? And
yeah, so I asked them the question if they still kept the magazines or the cookbooks. Obviously magazines are pretty ephemeral, but they did talk about how they'd ripped pages out and keep them in a cookbook that they've sort of collated on their own, and most of them said that they at least owned one of the actual published Women's Weekly cookbooks, which I thought was quite interesting.
Can I ask? So, because at the beginning you also said you chose sort of every third month, I think it was, sort of on it. have you tried to address the missing months in any kind of fashion? I mean, obviously you can't do them all, but sometimes you might miss sort of Easter, for example, and certain years or whatever.
Yeah, so what I sort of came across that I was getting a lot of the same, at least in the early years, you know, because I was looking at March, that often fell in Lent. So I was getting quite a lot of, you know, fish dishes and things like that. And so the beauty, I guess, of the weekly is that when I sort of pick up on the broader patterns, I can then look at various things that are interesting, and because it is keyword searchable, I can go in and have a look across the year and just see sort of what was happening there as well. So it's kind of like the slice sampling is the jumping off point to sort of get the broader picture, and then I can sort of narrow it down.
So yeah, it's sort of, you picked up other months where that
absolutely,
there.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I sort of started with those because it was like spring, winter, Christmas, but it's quite
sense,
easy to look at, which is good.
Do you remember your own mother cooking for it?
Yes.
Or whoever cooked it in your home?
I would say that if you asked any Australian born between, say, 1970 and today, you can guarantee that their mother has cooked them one of those birthday cakes from that birthday book. Yeah, absolutely. It's become such a cultural phenomenon. There's a stand-up comedian that's done a show about it, like that book. It's a really big thing in Australia. Yeah.
I can remember my mum doing Woman's Own menus, and it was kind of a big event following. After
Yeah.
It usually ended in disaster.
Yeah, and I mean, my mum definitely had the microwave cookbook in the 1980s, and that's an abomination. So. One should never microwave an entire chicken.
Sorry, me again. So based on the fact that you had some great visual sources, and also based on, I suppose, contemporary food popular culture, have you considered in your whole project like the aesthetics of food and how they may have changed over the decades?
Yes. So the concept of sort of food porn is something that I wanted to look at, and sort of seeing how and when that sort of started to become a really important part of food culture, at least in Australia. Even sort of what I've picked up on is photography was important all the way through. In most of the food editorials, there were pictures of the meals, or often pictures of starlets cooking food, trying to make things more interesting. And they were coloured quite early. They made the pictures coloured quite early, and even during the war, when coloured newsprint was really cut out of the magazine, the food editorials remained coloured. So I think that visual part was really important to the magazine and to making sort of food more, you know, enjoyable to look at. Yeah.
We kind of like all agree that the recipe magazine that reflect that society at the age, and then now we cannot really say that the only woman has to cook, and then that the magazine's name is still saying that this is for women. And have you seen any even the other magazines in Australia the features the cooking for man, or I'm really interested in responsibilities in domestic cooking, the changes, the power relations and things, because for instance, I'm from Japan, and in Japan we have some books for men's cooking, but it's again it's kind of a dichotomies between men against women sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I know that Jamie Oliver is really popular even in Australia, and there are lots of contest television programs like MasterChef, and which has lots of male chef. So yeah, I want to know more about this.
Yeah, I mean, definitely in Australia there is that dichotomy where the domestic is feminine and the public, so chefs, are men. The interesting thing about the weekly is that even from its sort of earliest times, men were readers of the weekly, and I think it was in the late 1930s, 10% of Australian men had read a women's weekly magazine, because they were, they had stuff in them other than cookery and, news features and so on. And probably from the 1970s, we sort of start to see features targeted towards men, particularly when it comes to cooking meat and things like barbecues, which were considered manly. But there were even, so we had the Great Australian Bake Off, basically, back in the 1960s, and there were categories for men to do baking that were really highly publicised in the magazine. And even I've come across dieting features for men. So men were definitely there, but women were expected to be the main providers or main cooks in the household, definitely. Yeah, and I would say that is still the way that it's sort of focused. Yeah.
Have you seen the Len Dayton cookery strips here?
Sorry?
Len Dayton cookery strips. Well, he's known as a thriller writer, but he did a cookery strip. I can't remember which one of the Sunday newspapers, I forget which one. Probably, I don't know, late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, okay.
But he was very much geared at the sexy man.
Yes.
Doing something quick and
yes.
picking it up. In fact, it features in one of the Michael Caine films. It opens up and Michael Caine is whipping up one of these.
Yeah, well, there was definitely that sort of suave,
very
sort of global globetrotter, sort of like the Galloping Gourmet and that sort of thing. Yeah, definitely sort of the man about town cook. Yes, yes. So that was
very
definitely
good recipes, actually.
Okay, I have to share an anecdote here. Sorry, I'm going to stop talking about my old stories in a second. But in about the early 1980s, I was in North Queensland. And I was working as a gillaroo, which is kind of untranslatable, but I was out at the barbecue, and I was told I was not supposed to be at the barbecue. I should be in the kitchen with the women. I stayed at the barbecue. I was not very happy with that. But I did actually have a serious question as well. Again, drawing on my own experience, but just thinking about the relationship between England, the UK, and you. I certainly experienced a great deal of sense of cultural cringe. And that things that were British or English were better than things that were Australian. And, in my childhood, when it was 40 degrees on Christmas Day, we would be eating hot baked turkey with all of the baked trimmings and a hot plum pudding and custard. Certainly up until up until the sort of mid-70s. In my experience, then it started to change. So I wonder what you saw in terms of that culture, if you saw that cultural cringe in what you were looking at, of, this is as good as the old country sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely there, especially sort of in the, I'd say up until the post-war sort of period, is very much, these are our old traditional English recipes and how great they are, and the way that they've been, people have been eating these for hundreds of years and they're wonderful, so why would we ever change anything? But then sort of after the war, you start seeing little bits creep in where it's like, well, Australia has access to these ingredients and this, and that's sort of what makes it sort of better, I guess, as that more cosmopolitan sort of outlook came in post-war. It's really interesting. I think Australia still has sort of a cultural cringe about food, even though, now we have, a cuisine of some sort, I guess, that's sort of recognisable and quite good. It's still there, yeah.
Anyone else? No?
Sneaking.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
It's a little bit of a silly question, but I was really interested in the mock champagne, and
Yes.
I was wondering if you knew how you made it.
Yeah, so when I first saw it, I thought, well, maybe this. So it was during the 1930s, so I thought it was maybe sort of like a non-alcoholic champagne sort of substitute, but it absolutely wasn't. It was fermented gooseberries mainly, but some of it was would have been really awful, just like lemon juice, sort of fermented with some sugar. It just sounded awful. But yeah, the gooseberry one I thought sounded actually okay. But it was definitely like fermented, and it was designed to stand in place of champagne, which I would have been out of the reach. I mean, expense-wise, but also, I guess in terms of space, like, how are you going to get champagne in North Queensland? It'd be a pretty hard place to get champagne. So yeah, very interesting.
Well, I think it's very interesting also the aspect of the fantasy aspect of it, especially for non-middle class women reading this magazine, how they shaped the idea of being middle class. That I think could be a very interesting aspect.
Yeah, definitely. Because it was read by a really wide socioeconomic range, and if people didn't buy it themselves, they often, you know, shared it around and that sort of thing. I think the majority of readers were sort of lower middle class to sort of middle class in surveys that they did. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to turn the live stream off now. So thank you everyone that was online, and we will see you next time around in October.
So you can ask now.